Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we try to cut through some of the noise around complex topics. Today, we're looking into migration, and specifically the labels we use, words like migrant, asylum seeker, refugee. These aren't just words you can swap around. They have real legal meaning, they shape how society sees people, and they really impact lives. So our mission here is to get past that fuzziness and understand what these labels actually mean legally and socially.
Yeah, it's definitely needed. The confusion is actually pretty significant. I mean, one of our sources pointed out that the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, they actually had to create media guidelines just to clarify things.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it just shows how easily the conversation gets, confused or even worse, dehumanizing if we don't use the terms correctly.
Okay, right. So let's start at the beginning then. Why do people move in the first place? It seems like there's a huge range of reasons.
Oh, absolutely. People might move for economic reasons,
Mm.
better jobs, or maybe joining family or for study.
Sure, normal life stuff.
Exactly. But then there are others who are actively fleeing, conflict, persecution, maybe religious, political, terrorism, serious human rights violations, or even climate change impacts, natural disasters.
That huge variety. That's probably why the precise terms matter so much.
Precisely. Refugee, asylum seeker, migrant, they aren't just descriptions, they're technical legal terms. And those definitions directly affect a person's rights and what countries are obligated to do.
Okay, let's dig into the big one first. Refugee. Where does that specific legal definition come from?
The main source is the 1951 Geneva Convention. It's been signed by, I think, over 3/4 of UN member states, so it's widely accepted.
And what does it actually say? How does it define a refugee?
It's quite specific. A refugee is someone who is outside their home country.
Okay, has to be outside.
Yes, and they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for one of 5 reasons.
Right.
Race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion.
Just those 5.
Just those 5. Under the 51 Convention, yes. And this is crucial. They have to be unable, or maybe unwilling because of that fear, to get protection from their own country.
So those 5 grounds, they sound very specific. What if someone's fleeing, say, a massive drought or total economic collapse? Does that fit?
Generally, no. Not under the strict 1951 definition. The core idea is targeted persecution based on one of those 5 grounds. Fleeing generalized disaster or poverty usually puts someone in the broader category of migrant.
Right. And if someone is recognized as a refugee, what does that mean legally? What protection do they get?
The absolute cornerstone is the principle of non-refoulement.
Non-refoulement, French
Yeah.
for non-return, right.
Exactly. It means you cannot forcibly send a refugee back to a place where their life or freedom would be threatened because of those 5 grounds. That one principle is fundamental. It completely changes the legal situation compared to, say, someone whose tourist visa runs out. They can legally be returned home. A refugee cannot, if it means returning to danger.
Okay, so refugee status provides that core protection. But you mentioned asylum seekers. That sounds like a step before becoming a refugee.
It is. An asylum seeker is someone who has arrived in a country or at a border and has asked for international protection. They've made a claim to be recognized as a refugee.
So it's like in the process?
Exactly. It's a temporary status while the authorities examine their claim, determine if they meet the refugee definition. Not everyone who seeks asylum will be granted refugee status in the end.
But every refugee was an asylum seeker first.
Correct. Every single recognized refugee started out as an asylum seeker. And it's really important to remember, seeking asylum is a fundamental human right.
Okay, got it. So refugee, asylum seeker. What about migrant? That feels like the catch-all term.
It sort of is.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike refugee, migrant isn't formally defined in international law in the same way. It's generally understood to mean anyone moving away from their usual place of residence.
For any reason.
Pretty much. Often distinctions are made between short-term moves, like 3 to 12 months, and long-term, over a year. Academics sometimes debate it. There's an inclusivist view where it covers all movement, and a residualist view that tries to exclude people fleeing persecution, reserving migrant for other types of movement.
But even if someone is, say, an economic migrant or moving for family and they don't fit the refugee definition, they still have basic human rights, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. That's a critical point. Regardless of why someone moves or their legal status, every single person is entitled to have their fundamental human rights protected. Governments have obligations to protect everyone from things like racism, exploitation, violence, forced labor. That doesn't depend on being a refugee.
And our sources mention other types under that migrant umbrella too, right? Like financial migrants, students, professionals. Also, terms like sojourners.
Yes, sojourners are usually people moving for a limited time with the clear intention of returning home eventually. And then there are those in exile people specifically forbidden from returning to their country.
This whole idea of movement, forced or voluntary, makes me think about children specifically. They seem especially vulnerable.
They absolutely are.
Yeah.
And the scale, it's heartbreaking. UNICEF estimated back in 2016, almost 50 million children were on the move globally. That includes those displaced inside their own countries and those crossing borders.
50 million.
And of those, around 28 million had fled violence and insecurity.
Just like with adults, I guess the language matters for children too. You mentioned unaccompanied versus separated children.
Yes, and it's a really important distinction for practical reasons. For protection, unaccompanied children are those traveling completely alone, without a parent or any other legal or customary caregiver.
Okay, totally on their own.
Right. Separated children are separated from their parents or primary caregiver, but they might be with another relative, like an aunt, uncle, or even an older sibling.
And that difference impacts how they're helped.
Definitely. An unaccompanied child usually needs immediate state care and guardianship procedures. For a separated child, the first step is often assessing if the relative they are with can actually provide safe and appropriate care. The protection needs are different.
And why are these kids leaving home? Is it similar reasons to adults?
Often, yes. Fleeing war, thinks Syria, Ukraine, escaping persecution, maybe ethnic or religious. Gang violence is a huge driver in places like Central America. Natural disasters like the Haiti earthquake in 2010.
Are there other reasons too?
Sadly, yes. Sometimes children are trafficked, maybe lured by false promises, sometimes even unknowingly facilitated by desperate families. Some flee the threat of early or forced marriage, and others are trying to reunite with family who've already moved, maybe parents in the U.S. or Europe.
And being alone or just separated must put them at enormous risk.
Huge risks. I mean, there's the obvious physical hardship, finding food, water, shelter. But then there's the danger of abuse, violence, exploitation from smugglers, criminal gangs, sometimes even officials.
That's horrifying.
It is. And health issues are a major concern. Malnutrition, dehydration, plus specific needs for kids with disabilities or illnesses. And then layered on top of all that.
The social side, stigma.
Exactly. Hostility, stigma, discrimination. It can be verbal harassment, extortion, or even systematic discrimination built into state systems. We see cases of inappropriate treatment by officials, maybe getting their age assessed incorrectly, putting teenagers in detention with adults.
Or even being sent back. Refoulement.
That danger is always there, yes. Being sent back into the very danger they fled. But there's a framework meant to protect them. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC.
Which most countries have signed.
Pretty much all of them, 196 countries. And it fully applies. It clearly states that all decisions concerning a child must prioritize the best interests of the child. Article 20, for instance, specifically says children not living with their family need special protection and assistance.
Okay, so we have the legal definitions, the protections, but this brings us to how these legal terms morph into social labels, right? You mentioned Amnesty International saying these labels describe experiences, not identities. But that's not always how it works in practice, is it?
No, it's often not. The legal status becomes a social identity, a label. And this ties into different academic ways of thinking about identity itself. There's the essentialist perspective.
Essentialist, meaning?
It basically assumes there's one fixed, sort of authentic set of characteristics shared by everyone in a group. Like, all refugees are traumatized victims, or all migrants just want economic benefits. It simplifies things massively.
Which sounds like a recipe for stereotype.
Absolutely. The alternative is the non-essentialist perspective. This view focuses more on differences within groups, as well as similarities between groups. It sees identity as more fluid, changing over time. It challenges the idea that a temporary label like refugee defines a person forever.
And how does society actually apply these labels in a way that sticks? You mentioned labeling theory. Something about the dramatization of evil. That sounds pretty stark.
It is stark. It comes from thinkers like Tannenbaum. The idea is that a community can shift its focus from defining an act as bad.
Like, say, crossing a border without commission.
Right. To defining the person who did the act as inherently bad, as an outcast. And Tannenbaum's key point was that the individual can internalize this label. His phrase was chilling. The person becomes the thing he is described as being.
Wow. So if society constantly labels migrants as, I don't know, burdens or illegals, they might start to see themselves that way.
It can absolutely undermine their sense of self-worth, yeah. And this individual process is often reinforced by a bigger social process, othering.
Othering. Creating an us and a them.
Exactly. Academics like Grove and Zui talk about it as creating these artificial categories through marginalization and social exclusion. You basically define a norm, usually the host community, and then you mark the other group, the migrants or refugees, as different, as deviant from that norm.
And the weird thing is, it's less about understanding the other and more about boosting the identity of the U.S. group.
That's often how it functions, yes. It reinforces the U.S. by defining the them.
Sure.
And you see the language of othering everywhere in public discourse.
Like what?
Catastrophic language, flood of migrants, refugee crisis, moral judgments, queue jumpers, bogus asylum seekers. Even supposedly neutral terms like burden sharing can frame people as objects rather than humans.
And it's not just words, is it? You mentioned physical barriers.
Right. Othering is maintained physically, too. Things like building walls, putting people in remote detention centers or large isolated camps. These things prevent genuine interaction between communities.
So the stereotypes just fester because people don't actually meet each other.
Exactly. The label stands unchallenged by real human connection.
And this internalization of stigma, this othering, it must have mental health consequences.
Definitely. Research by Link and others highlights this connection. When people internalize negative societal views about their group, it leads to what they call an expectation of rejection.
Expectation of rejection, meaning they just assume people will treat them badly.
Pretty much. And that expectation makes them much less likely to reach out for help, whether it's mental health support or even just basic social connection. It leads to isolation.
Which could explain why some studies show low help-seeking rates among refugees, even when they've clearly experienced trauma.
It's a big factor. They often face this double bind. On one hand, maybe cultural reasons for not seeking help attributing distress to personal weakness or spiritual causes, and on the other hand, facing genuinely hostile or unwelcoming environments in the host country, which just confirms that expectation of rejection.
So how does all this stigma, this othering, get amplified? Where does the media fit in? And politicians, symbolic elites?
They play a huge role. Media outlets, political figures, they are key players in reproducing dominant ideas and shaping how the public sees these issues. Often the focus becomes threat, numbers, crisis, rather than the full human story.
There was that UK press study you mentioned, Gabriel Taltos. It showed a difference between newspaper types.
Yes, a study from 2008. It found that the broadsheet papers, the more serious ones, tended to use a wider range of terms, some neutral or even positive, like exile. They often presented more balanced arguments and put the issue in a bigger international or social context.
But the tabloids?
The tabloids were different. They frequently used misleading, sometimes legally nonsensical terms, things like illegal refugees, which doesn't make sense legally, or genuine immigrants. They really injected a strong legal and criminal frame, made the whole act of moving sound inherently suspicious or illegal.
And this framing often uses stereotypes, right? Particularly around gender or age.
Absolutely. A 2022 study by Ryan and Tonkis looked at gender. They found lone adult men seeking refuge were often shown using images like police mugshots or in courtroom settings.
Instantly framing them as a threat or a criminal.
Exactly. Whereas refugee women were frequently depicted with children, maybe looking vulnerable in a camp. This tended to give their claims a sense of genuineness in the media narrative.
But that comparison implicitly makes the men seem less genuine or less vulnerable.
That's the risk, yes. If the woman with a child becomes the standard for genuine refugee, where does that leave the single man fleeing persecution? It subtly reinforces his perceived lack of vulnerability.
That framing based on appearance, it also happened with children, didn't it? But in a really disturbing way.
Yes, the Rosencrafter study from 2018 on separated children arriving in the UK. Initially, the tabloids used quite a sympathetic humanitarian frame, refugee kids.
Okay, standard stuff.
But then, as more children arrived, the tone shifted dramatically. They started using what the researchers called ontological framing.
Ontological framing. What's that in plain English?
But basically questioning their very being, their identity as children. They started putting the word child in scare quotes.
Like child, as if they doubted it.
Precisely. And they focused intensely on physical descriptions, reporting things like stubble or crow's feet or receding hairlines on teenagers. The goal was clearly to cast doubt on their age, their authenticity, and therefore their right to protection as children.
Wow. So the narrative shifted from vulnerable kids needing help to what? Potential deceivers? Security risks?
Exactly that. It created a security frame. Suddenly, these young people were portrayed as a potential threat, trying to trick the system. And the British public was positioned as the potential victim of this perceived deception.
And this kind of discrimination, driven by media narratives, it has real effects on young people's well-being.
It does. There was a study in Denmark, Montgomery, and Foldsbang in 2007 looking at young refugees from the Middle East. They found a strong link between experiencing discrimination, difficulties with social adaptation, and internalizing behavior problems, things like depression.
And did they find out who is most likely to experience discrimination?
Interestingly, yes. Male gender was the single strongest predictor for reporting discrimination. Tangible things, like being refused entry to a club or facing harassment. It just shows these media frames and social labels aren't abstract. They translate into daily negative experiences.
It really brings home how powerful these labels are. Is there a final caution from the academic side on using these categories?
Yes, there's a warning against what's called categorical fetishism.
Fetishizing.
Yeah, it sounds odd, but it means treating these classifications, refugee, migrant, asylum seeker, as if they're totally real, fixed, unchanging things about a person rather than what they often are. Temporary legal statuses or socially constructed labels. Researchers need categories to study inequalities, of course, but they shouldn't forget the huge diversity of experience within those categories. We risk homogenizing people.
That makes sense. So wrapping this up, it feels like there are two big takeaways for anyone listening. First, the technical differences between labels like refugee, asylum seeker, and migrant really, really matter, both legally and ethically.
Absolutely. Understanding those precise definitions is step one for any informed discussion or policy.
And second, we need to be really aware of how these labels are used socially, especially in media and politics, how they're actively constructed, how they often lead to stigma and othering.
Yes, recognizing that the label isn't just a neutral descriptor, it's often a tool of social power with real psychological impacts on the individuals involved. It shapes how they're seen and how they see themselves.
That idea of social power and maybe finding a way beyond the US versus them.
Yeah.
You mentioned a concept from psychoanalysis, the moral third. What's that about?
It comes from thinkers like Jessica Benjamin. The idea is that often the state, or dominant groups, create this binary us versus them, citizen versus migrant, deserving versus undeserving. The moral third represents a potential space, a shared principle or perspective that stands outside that binary.
Like a common ground of humanity.
Sort of. It's about finding a position that acknowledges shared humanity and ethical principles, even when powerful forces are trying to divide people.
So the final thought for our listeners to chew on.
It's this. Given that the state and media often push this us versus them division, how can we, as individuals who are now maybe more informed about these labels and processes, choose to act differently? How can we strive to be witnesses to the suffering of others, recognizing their inherent dignity, seeing the person beyond the label, and perhaps holding power accountable for rights violations rather than just accepting the imposed categories and judgments? How do we occupy that moral third space?